have any opening remarks before we get started with the agenda?
Go ahead, Eric. You're good. Great. You're muted, Eric.
Sorry. One of the things that we talked about at our last meeting was that I was going to reach out to the Vera Institute and discuss with them the possibility of joining one of our meetings to talk about some of the findings they had from the first JJRC session and work group. And so I did have that meeting on February 12th, and it went really well. And Vera is open to coming back and meeting with us at one of our broader meetings. We just need to identify a date where we would think that it would be good for them to talk to the larger group and get that scheduled out. And then Nate and I may meet with them at least one additional time just to, talk about the agenda and exactly which information they are preparing for us. But the biggest takeaway is that we should look at a future date in one of the general sessions to give the Vera Institute to talk about some of the data they provided for us last time, and also some best practices around narrative change and how data is an important factor in narrative change. So any thoughts on a potential date? Yes, Bethany.
Sorry, can I ask what the thinking is behind having this meeting kind of in the context of the full commission versus this work group? Like, would we consider holding it during one of this work group's time and of course opening it up to the entire commission? Mm-hmm. But I was just looking at the list of future commission meetings. We have so few between now and kind of the official end of our first year. Mm-hmm. I'm sure we could put it in one of those meetings, but we could do it sooner, I think, if we did it during one of the times we've already set aside for this work group.
Okay. I think we're open to that. I know one of the considerations, one of the things that we've been talking about is how information is shared and how this work group is going to intersect with the other work groups. So I think once we hear more about that, it will, help us to make more sense around which stage is best for Vera, whether it be this group or the broader group. I think our initial thought was just to have that context for the broader group to understand about, the information they provided. But it just skips a step, because if then they come to this meeting, then we would be taking that to the broader session. So I don't think that we are too, married to whichever process, but that's just kind of where we are right now.
I see Mark has his hand up, but I just want to say, I think that later in our agenda today, I think this is going to come up, because I think one of our conversations is how are we making sure we're not overlapping with other work groups? How are we making sure we're communicating with each other? And so this, I think we can use this as an example of that when we get there. But Mark, sorry, why don't you chime in?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. Yeah, I know this came up, I think at literally the first commission meeting that Judge Davis talked about, the JJRC recommendations. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess I would suggest two things. One, I would say the sooner the better. And secondly, I really think it makes sense to have it before the broader group. I think that body of work is so relevant to all the work that folks are talking about that I think it would be a missed opportunity to have it just in front of one of the small work groups. So, I think our thinking as the impacting the narrative was that's information that should be available more broadly. And so I actually think the larger commission should hear that and hear it as soon as possible, because it really it's a lot of groundwork for the work that all of the work groups are going to be wrestling with. So I would strongly urge us, one, to have it as soon as possible, and two, to have it as part of the one of the larger meetings.
I think that some of what Eric talked about with them might be more appropriate for our work group. Like that, this is some of their guidance on narrative change, I think could be there. But I think the broader, like, discussing JJRC clearly has like implications for the commission as a whole. So like how to do that is a good question.
Any other thoughts, preferences on Vera's presentation and here or larger group?
So there exist various publications from that last go around with them that I'm hoping everyone's seen. So this would be them just kind of walking us through what's in those.
I think it just sort of, yeah, I think we have it's good that we have this public documentation of what happened in those, the presentations themselves. And pretty much each meeting had a presentation on kind of like the national best practices on the topic, and then a closer look at what was happening in Maryland. Mm-hmm. But I think they also, so they could speak to some of that, but I think also giving a broader overview of like what the approach was, how they thought about it over that time, anything that's changed in that time as they've seen it nationally. So they'd be able to, I think, give that full perspective. But I agree, John, like, I think the whole commission would do well to go back and look. Sometimes like a static PowerPoint can be a little hard to know, like, what were they saying? But there is a lot of good information in there that I think helps explain a lot about why the JJRC made the recommendations that we made. That's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think we shouldn't assume that too many people are actually familiar or who have read those reports.
Okay. So should we, I mean, I think, so do we have a consensus, or at least do we think that as a group, for the most part, it's best that we try to schedule this for the broader commission versus just our group? I just want to, before we move on, make sure I'm hearing everything correctly. Okay. All right. Hearing no opposition, let's move on to the survey results and some data that we may have gotten back from the survey that we sent out on last week for you to complete, so we can get some information about people's priorities for the work group and things that the direction that people feel like we should be going in.
So I made a quick PowerPoint to kind of summarize the slides, or summarize the questions, and we can go through this pretty fast. But this is like kind of a word cloud about what the dominant narratives that people are seeing when it comes to juvenile justice. You know, youth are out of control, juvenile crime is on the rise, the system is a revolving door, DGS is not getting results. That's kind of like these are the big things that we're seeing as far as narratives. And let me just quickly send a link to where you can find this PowerPoint. I don't know how fast we want to go through this, but the second slide is another word cloud about, you know, what people don't understand about the system, and like what is good, or like what do they see is happening that's positive when it comes to youth development. So we know that evidence-based practices work, early intervention is successful, intervention and diversion services work, youth crime is down, alternatives to confinement get better results. So it seems like most of the people were kind of circling around this idea that, you know, the evidence-based practices that we're doing are working, but most people don't realize that. The next slide is about what we're most interested in working on as a work group. Most people answered that they want to inform the general public as well as stakeholders.
I'm sorry, Ainsley, can you make this one a little bit bigger? Can you zoom
Yes, I'm trying to do that. I don't know if I can do that with my like little presentation. Let's see. Sorry.
Their own screen too. There's a little plus and minus
Mm,
in our view.
right. Yeah, I think unfortunately that's as big as I can make it right now. Sorry. And then there was not a lot of interest in, I know we talked about, or like there was some interest, but not an overwhelming interest in the other options. In terms of stakeholders people want to hear from, definitely impacted youth and impacted family members. After that are school officials, and then kind of people who are involved in the system after that. And then the person who said other also wanted to hear from business owners. The questions people mostly had about the juvenile justice system revolved around resources, such as where do the resources exist? Where are the gaps in the resources? How long does it take for youth to get resources? Differences in case decisions and programming. This means like geographically, you know, how are different counties approaching juvenile crime, as well as what are the like why certain cases get forwarded, why certain cases get dismissed. Kids with multiple system involvement, how many kids are there that, you know, have gone through several systems like DHS and ended up in DJS, as well as questions around the intake process, what the intake process looks like and how decisions are made. And then finally, the biggest misunderstandings that people thought the general public had about the juvenile system was the history and purpose of the juvenile justice system, as well as its components, such as why the juvenile system is separate from the adult system, why or how diversion works, why diversion works, the function of different players in the juvenile justice system, such as like DJS versus judges. There's a misunderstanding that punitive punishment works best for kids, and that nothing happens to youth involved in the DJS system. So this was just a really brief overview. And like I said, I have the PowerPoint if we want to discuss it more in the Dropbox. So those are kind of the survey results that I hope can kind of inform, you know, our discussion moving forward of how we want this work group to tackle these issues.
Is there anything to add? Anything that anyone did not have time to complete the survey? Anyone to respond to some of the questions or prompts right now?
Anything surprise anybody that you saw in there? Or does this seem like there's a lot of alignment on like what people are hearing?
I think there's a lot of alignment. I mean, one thing I've been thinking about is that when people fear, how do you deal with fear? You know, like they don't want to hear statistics. They want to not be fearful. And, you know, I always thought like the best argument is one of money, that what we're doing now, you know, isn't working and we could do it differently and have better outcomes. But I think it's really hard when you have a newspaper who every day is just talking all about it's a crime sheet. So, I mean, I think our challenge is really hard.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I don't think there's, I guess, two things. One, not surprised. You know, we know what's sort of out there, and that's, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is the Sentencing Project report on the, you know, sort of building on what Susan just said, what the media is putting out there, particularly one news outlet that's like a 24/7 operation, right? And so you can't sort of minimize the impact of that. So that's one thing. And I think consistent with the conversation that we had last time, I think it was, you know, the feeling amongst folks in this group that it's not the stakeholders that need to be educated. It's other folks, right? They may be other stakeholders and the general public or segments of the general public. But I think the folks who are involved in the system every day, they know what's happening and they, you know, understand it. Whether all people involved in the system every day sort of are putting information out that's consistent with the data, that's a separate conversation. But I think they're not necessarily the audience, I think, for the commission in terms of who to communicate with.
Aubrey.
Thanks. Yeah, Mike, I'm glad you brought that up. I think one of the things I was thinking through as we were looking through the results is that my own need maybe to be regrounded in like what the objective of this group in terms of whose mind we're trying to change and why. Like what is the action that we're hoping to inspire by the narrative change that we're creating? And maybe that's like multifold, but I think to your point, Mark, like the stakeholders, I think probably have a much more clear sense of information. And I think in terms of the harm we see in the media being done to like children and children who are involved in our juvenile justice system, like I don't think our stakeholders are the ones who are perpetuating that harm by their beliefs, right? So it's like who are we, whose minds are we trying to change? And then I feel like that would help guide for me, like prioritization of like segmentation for the messaging.
I mean, this is connected to the next item on here, but like, I think for me, one of the big questions has been that we have these two pieces in our charge, public education and narrative change. And they feel like, you know, two circles that are overlapping, but they're not the same. They're different. And the public education, especially as the ongoing nature of this commission, I actually, as someone who doesn't work in the system, I think that there is a lot about the way the system works that I don't know. And is nowhere to be seen. Like when John was saying, you can find these reports about what Vera said, or I can go and look at DJS's data resource guide and find tons of statistics, and I can find things about process as DJS has written it out. And Maryland may be one of the most centralized juvenile justice systems in the country, but everything that leads up to DJS intake is not centralized, right? We have school system. Each county has its own school system. Each county has its own police forces. There's local police forces. We don't understand, like we don't really understand how it's working in each county and what the data tell us about what's happening in each county. We don't know how many arrests come from schools versus how many arrests are coming from the community versus how many arrests are coming from some other source like public transportation or calls from just community members. We don't know. We don't know what police diversion looks like in each county and whether that's happening, and if so, how it's happening and what those numbers don't look like. We don't know when cases move from DJS to the state's attorney's office, really a lot about what's happening in court, what it means. DJS is publishing these words that tell you what's happening in the court process in their data resource guide. but I don't really understand what those things mean or what's actually happening in the court process. So I'm saying this in the sense of there's a way in which in Maryland, for good reason, but juvenile justice has become equated with the Department of Juvenile Services. And that's just not really true. And I think understanding the rest of the system is really important to understanding the big questions that I think people are asking. Sorry, my phone's ringing here. One sec. So I just think that I want to add that because while I think that I agree with this idea of like our job isn't to inform the system stakeholders of what's happening, I think needing to educate the public about the fuller system is really important to getting at some of the questions and the narratives that are up there about accountability and about a revolving door and about all these different things and understanding them. Like, I think we need to know more and report more. And I think that's why, to me, some of the questions on the next item of understanding our intersection with the other work groups is really important. So like I see Alicia here, like, you know, thinking about like how the system works broader, like, and is it our charge, for example, to ask the question and understand? So how would we find out what percentage of kids are getting arrested at school versus getting arrested in the community in each county? Like, is that since we're the public education group, should we be seeking that information? Or is that part of like understanding the system process? And our job is simply to get that from another committee and educate the public on it. But there's a lot of these. There's like a lot of these throughout in understanding. So when we start thinking about like, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to hear from different stakeholders in the throughout the state, including the different public officials? Maybe that's not the charge of our committee, but if we don't hear from people, it's going to be hard for us to educate and think about it. So like, maybe it's not our charge to hear from them, but it's got to be someone's charge to hear from them so that we can then do our role on the public education. So that I just want to say that's where I'm a little like stuck. I'm glad we have the survey results, because I think it's helpful to think about this, but I want to make sure we're not overstepping, but I want to make sure that all the ground's actually getting covered if it's not being covered in our committee.
Can I ask you a question? I sometimes think that we come off as policy wonks, and that I've never felt like advocacy groups know how to market. So, you know, we have all this information. You know, we don't have perfect information. We have some information. But we're losing in the legislature and, you know, with we're losing the battle of what message is getting out there. And so is our committee going to have access to expertise about how you do market? I mean, because you can have all the information if you turn off people because they don't want to hear your statistics. They only want to hear the story of, you know, how a kid who was, you know, really in trouble got help. Or, you know, like I thought when I went to the thing, Nate, you were putting on about where all those parents and kids, and they actually told their story, that was much more compelling. And I know, you know, you get upset about this thing, like we can't make policy based on this story because there's another bad story. But we're not succeeding at making policy on having the data, because we have the data on their side. So I'm just trying to figure out, how do you, how can we learn how to do that better?
Well, I think it was pretty. Oh, sorry, Eric. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, I mean, so one of the things separate from the presentation that we talked to Vera about doing to the broader group, but they were going to provide some information on narrative change and some best practices from other organizations across the country that are doing this work. So that's a part of the Vera ask as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
But are they like, I remember once Casey hired Hatchet Group or something. They were like, or there's marketing firms that, I don't know.
Yeah, no, there are, and maybe Vera will point us in, the direction of a few of those that are doing that on the national stage. But I think, we would probably only be able to get best practices for them, because hiring a firm, I don't know if that's in our purview or not, but we can definitely get some best practices. So that's our goal and what we hope to get from Vera. Alicia?
Thanks. I just wanted to respond to a few things that Nate said. First, I agree with Nate that right now the Department of Juvenile Services is bearing the brunt of other system failures and other decisions that are being made by the systems that impact kids. And so, in our work group, in the systems work group that Susan and I chair, we were very thoughtful about starting with jurisdiction, in part because it's at the front end of the life of an experience for a child, but also because it's so timely. And it may have no impact on this legislative session, but we wanted to give it a shot. But I think that directly after that, Nate, we're going to turn our attention to law enforcement and police and school police and diversion at that point of contact. I mean, we want to start at the very front end, which is before a child comes into contact with DJS. And so I think we're very open to hearing from those stakeholders and gathering information around that stage of things for a child.
I think it was Bethany and then John. Is that right?
Yeah, I was just going to say to the open question about kind of how does this work group interact with the others, kind of the way, we've talked about it with Judge Davis, and I think kind of if I'm remembering back to when we came up with this as a work group, the statute says participate in interpreting for the public the objectives of juvenile services in the state. And so I could see where, for example, Alicia and Susan hosted the sentencing project and GOCAP's data team, kind of talking about the process of charging and some of the outcomes, as far as the data we currently collect allows us to measure outcomes, or kind of going back to the first commission-wide meeting where we heard from DJS about kind of their process, that I could see something where this work group then comes together and says, okay, how do we package this in a way that the public can understand? And I think one of the things this work group talked about last time it met was kind of ways to deliver that information. And I think one pagers came up, and I know Aaron, you kind of followed up with some thoughts about how to package it. And I don't know. I think one of the things I've heard Judge Davis say is, like, people can't spin data. I mean, they can, but yeah,
They do.
They do. I know I shouldn't have said that because it's absolutely not true to say that you can't spin data. You can. but that, you know, we can present information that is very persuasive kind of in the information itself and kind of say, here are some common things you might hear, and here's what the data says about them, kind of based on kind of the substantive work that the other work groups are doing, that the commission is hearing. Like, for example, the Center on the Law of Brain and Behavior is presenting on the 5th. Maybe one of the follow-ups this work group does is, I think it's common knowledge to most of the people here, but like, here's actually how different a 16-year-old brain is from a 26-year-old one, and kind of being like a feedback loop. Like, here's what the commission heard, here's how we want to share it with the public, based on the narratives we know we're hearing, and how can we address those narratives. And then I think, and it could be this group or it could be others, I think this group in my mind makes the most sense to do some of the listening. I think that's kind of a really important piece that this group might make the most sense to do. That's my 2 cents.
And John, I'll go to you in a sec. I just, one thing Bethany, I appreciate that is like, I just want to say, because this is somewhat maybe disagreeing again with a little bit with Mark was saying before, which is sort of like my experience in working in different places is that, like, working in a system, there is always a whole wide range of opinions and different truths as well, which shouldn't be, but that's how it is. Whether it's in an agency or across agencies, people have different versions of how things actually work. And it sometimes takes bringing people in together and mapping it out and actually talking it through about how it actually is happening. Again, like, DGS has an awesome like chart in their thing that like lays out, here's how this system works. But I'll tell you, like, a couple of years ago, we facilitated meetings across agencies that was DJS with the Department of Human Services and the Department of Health, understanding the intersections of their systems with kids coming through and how that worked. And it was incredible how much people, like, what people thought versus like when you started talking it through, how it actually worked. And so I think that there is value in understanding how people are seeing things in order, again, to start challenging and pushing on narratives, so that we really understand how people are seeing the way the system is working, so that we can really feel like we have an objective sense. Sorry, John.
No, that's fine. So, I've been doing this for 20 years and I've gotten pretty good about reporting data that's accurate. And I'm a policy guy and I'm a data guy. But when you look at that first slide in terms of public perception, that's not data driven. That's anecdote. And you go to a hearing and people talk about, well, I know a kid who stole 3 cars and you guys didn't do anything. That's what drives the perception. It's not the data. But I don't have the skill set to, like, how does one use data, which, across the board is great. I mean, kids that are diverted do great. Kids who go through our system do great. But I don't have the skills to use that to counter those very kind of, the hooks from those anecdotes that people are using to drive the perception out there. And I think maybe that's where we could use some kind of messaging help on how do we use the good news from the data to counter the bad news from the anecdote.
And can I step in because there's silence? And
Sure.
I think that's kind of, there's a couple different ways, right? When you're in that situation where you have so much anecdotes driving what's happening in the policy world, you can focus on your policymakers and make sure that they really are armed with the information so that they don't take the bait to make bad decisions based on, wild anecdotes. Or you can like try to educate the public to like hold the policymakers kind of feet to the fire to really make evidence-based decisions. Those are very different tasks. And like very different skill sets, I would say, that are needed. So that's where I guess I was trying to figure out a little bit more, like, are we trying to do both? Are we trying to do one or the other? Or are we trying to do like a different kind of thing with regards to the changing of the narrative?
Any other feedback?
I guess I wonder how this lands with people. Like, if when we talk about narrative change, what if, does it resonate with anyone to say what we could accomplish, at least kind of as an initial step, is here's the narrative and here's what we know, and kind of you decide for yourself, like whether, like what rings more true or not, kind of rather than and maybe it's not rather than, but kind of the other way to think of it is kind of like a advocacy project, which could naturally happen, but is this work group kind of saying here's a narrative and here's what we've learned, discovered, researched, and found, that either confirms or tells us something different about what's really happening. And it's a little bit less assertive, but this is kind of how what I'm juggling in my mind. I wonder how that lands for people.
Beth, you mean as a you talking about as a graphic? You're thinking of a graphic,
or just like kind of thinking about how we orient towards these kind of dual purposes of public education and narrative change, and maybe they're kind of more overlapping than you might think, and that the narrative change piece may just be, here's a narrative. One of the things that was on one of Ainsley's first slide, that kids aren't being held accountable, versus the number of kids that are actually being processed and having some formal outcome from the system. So it's, this work group has then taken the narrative and provided an answer based on like actual information. And so it is accomplishing education and also kind of taking on these narrative statements.
well, I like that. I like that option. Ainsley?
I don't know if Dr. Betzinger is about to bring up what I brought up. I think instead of maybe, I know that he sent us like an article about, disproving myths and making sure that, the literature says that like quote unquote disproving like narratives or myths often reinforces them. And so maybe instead of like taking on these narratives, instead we're just creating our new narrative that, maybe we can package it in a way that's not like, here's our response to what's happening. It's more of like here's what we're seeing. And it's not specifically talking about, this narrative or that narrative. It's just simply like, here's what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up. So thanks.
Aaron, do you want to expand on that a little more? Just because, like, I think it's good conversation, and part of me is I don't know how much we need to figure out our tactics on this now, and I think there's a lot more to discuss about how broad we want to talk about with narratives. Anyway, I think when we had our charge, part of the idea of the narratives is not just about the narratives that are dominating the justice system or youth crime, but it's also about how it expands to youth more broadly and how it crowds out the more positive narratives about young people that are missing in our media and otherwise because of this. But I'd love to hear more about that point.
Yeah, I think someone brought up myth busting the last time, and we used to have someone that worked at the Institute with us who strongly encouraged or discouraged us from doing a myth busting approach, because as Ainsley brought up, when you hear the myth tends to be what gets reinforced, not the facts. And so I just decided to say that we should probably not take that approach. I do think there's a way to, as Ainsley suggested, highlight the narrative that we want to highlight, not the myth. And then I do think too, what someone brought up, the fact that there's all these anecdotes coming up, or maybe it was John. Why can't we highlight positive anecdotes? I mean, there's got to be cases that folks know of youth who are succeeding that we can bring into the fold here.
Yeah, I think that was one of Susan's points. Yeah.
Yep.
One other thing, you know, a lot of the other agent, like there was a commission 2 years ago and came up with really good stuff. And then there was a terrible backlash because the other agencies didn't like that juvenile services was taking an evidence-based approach in dealing with the kids that they really should deal with. And there's this whole issue, well, who's going to take care of the kids that you know, like, you know, the schools don't want them, DSS doesn't want them, the health department doesn't want them. And so I do think there is anger when, you know, you try to do the right thing without having everybody brought on. Or maybe it's just, you know, we're tribal and, you know, like everybody likes the idea that juvenile services, you know, we're tough on crime and they're the ones that, you know, when these kids should not be dealt with by juvenile services. There should be a way, you know, of dealing, you know, we just, you know, like for years, I represented kids, and if you were Black and you were a conduct disorder and, you know, you went to juvenile, and if you were white, you were emotionally disturbed, and the school was supposed to take care of you. So, I mean, and that was like among all the things. So I think there is anger out there that their perception of what juvenile service is supposed to be doing, juvenile services said, no, the data doesn't support that. We should be, you know, taking another thing. I don't know. Maybe that's totally off base.
I mean, I think it brings us back to our original point, or one of the original points that Nate was making, in that part of our charge is to try to educate the public or people in general about the process from the very beginning. So maybe we start with what happens from that first contact with a young person, whether it be in school or in the community or with police, and their entryway into the Department of Juvenile Services or into any system. I think that is a good starting point for us to, and then be able to educate people around what that process looks like, because there is a lot of misinformation out there and people really not understanding what happens from the very beginning to, you know, adjudication and detention or what, you know, whatever the individual cases may be. Mark?
Well, the other thing is, I noticed when I read the previous commission, there was this whole thing that was never done, which was that what they didn't finish doing was what are the, you know, what are the kids and what are the services and who is doing, you know, like the whole picture of what are the services for kids and who's responsible for knowing where those services is. Anybody on our commission looking at that array and how that, because, you know, Hogan hollowed out all services for 8 years. So
yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about, looking at what happens from the very first point of contact with the state official, police officer, school, you know, school administrator, and then their entry point into the Department of Juvenile Services. Mark, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Well, two things. One, I think in response to Susan, so I think there's a couple of work groups who are looking at sort of really presenting the full continuum. And as I think Vinny has shared, like we have some funding from the federal government, which hopefully will continue to help map that out. And we want to work closely with, as Aaron's referring this as well, work closely with the commission to develop and share that information. So that was in response to Susan's question. On this other issue, and I apologize, I was multitasking a little bit, but it's directly on point. So like we're right now dealing with incoming inquiries about, some may have heard, it's sort of breaking a shooting at the Columbia Mall, I think yesterday or the day before, and they've arrested a suspect who's, I think, an 18-year-old who apparently, you know, I have not personally verified any of this, so I'm just sharing what's been coming to me, was on an ankle monitor. So of course, everybody is saying, oh, there we go, DJS. Turns out, it appears, we're fairly confident at this point, this youth is not under DJS supervision. This is a case in the adult court. He's under an adult monitor. He did have one prior probation. I shouldn't speak individually, so I won't go further than that. But this is not a youth under our supervision. But there's an assumption. You know, when Nate was talking about, we know a lot about sort of DJS, right? John's team does an amazing job of collecting and producing data. We're very transparent with that data. I asked Nate a couple of weeks ago to, you know, as far as state agencies around the country, how do we compare with other state juvenile justice agencies, both in terms of collecting the data, analyzing and presenting it. And I think Nate, you said we're like in like the top, like there may not be another state agency that collects as much information and makes it available anywhere in the country. And that is, I am not taking any credit for that. That was in existence before this administration got here. John's been doing that work for a long time. And kudos to the prior administration who really invested in that. But it does strike me, sort of what Nate was talking about, is we know very little about the rest of the system, right? And what came to my mind, I was actually looking for the image, and some of you guys may be familiar, that old cartoon, the guy who's under a street light looking for his keys, right? And somebody comes over and says, oh, what are you looking for? I'm looking for my keys. I lost them over there. Well, why are you looking here? Well, that's where that's where the light is, right? And I think we have that's a dynamic that we have right now in this system, is there's so much information and so much out there about DJS that everybody just looks automatically at a DJS for the information. And that's whether it's a young person who's in the adult system, right? I have no idea what kind of information is out there about people in the adult system, or whether it's things that happen with kids before they get to DJS, right? As Nate says, and that's very localized, right? Police, prosecutors, schools. But I don't think there's lots of information out there about that. And so it tends to get focused on DJS, and that's fine. We can handle it, right? We're continue to put information out there, but it does make sort of decision-making about policy difficult, right? In this type of environment. So I just want to sort of share that. I think I think for us, this group, this commission will never have enough resources to change the narrative about kids in the juvenile justice system for the public, right? It just, like, that would take a lot of resources. But I think we can share the information that the commission has, that the council had, with key stakeholders like legislators and others. And I think it's incumbent upon the commission to speak strongly, to say, whether that's the other, decision makers and the media, that the information that they then put out there or make decisions on should be based on the data and the research, not, just all the noise out there. So I think I would encourage us to think about how we can focus our attention and speak very strongly to those folks. I mean, after all, it's the legislature that created this commission, right? So in some ways, they are the primary audience that we should be sure that information that's being provided to them by the commission is clear and accurate. So that's where I would sort of lean in if I was, sort of recommending our focus.
Okay, I think Aubrey, I think you had your hand up at one point, and then Ainsley, and we are really close up on time. So.
Oh, if I had my hand up, that was a mistake.
Okay, Ainsley.
I think if we're like looking at next steps, I think what I've heard from this work group and a lot of other work groups is it sounds like everybody is really interested in hearing from key stakeholders. And so I'm wondering if that is more of a commission-wide thing that, we set up ad hoc stakeholder meetings that anybody from any work group can attend. And so this work group's charge is less listening, although like everybody can attend those sessions, and more packaging and more like responding to these narratives and creating their own narratives. If that sounds kind of like, because I know we were going to have listening sessions as part of this group, but maybe making that like a commission-wide thing, since it seems like everybody is interested in hearing from one group or another.
Ansley, who's monitoring to make sure that all the groups aren't doing the same thing? Like, in other words, how it all comes together?
We are. So Ansley and I are in all of the work group meetings. And then starting in March, we'll do kind of work group report outs. So, we'll be kind of internally, tracking that, and there'll be a chance for group sharing at the commission meetings.
So for to Ainsley's point, so it sounds like we are going to look to schedule some sessions that any work group member, if you're a member of any of the work groups, you can attend these sessions with stakeholders, right? That's one direction we seem to be moving in. And then we still have our specific calling as public education, narrative change. We still can bring in groups and experts to talk about best practices that are happening across the country around narrative change. And we talked about Vera being one of those groups. So I'm just trying to get a clear path forward as to next steps.
So in terms of Vera, we'll work with Judge Davis on kind of what makes the most sense for where to plug them in, and can, once we have that conversation, offer some dates and times. It might be helpful, and Angie and I can work on this, kind of synthesizing what we've heard today and kind of putting together like a proposal for like the next few meetings in terms of topic and format and output. Because I think it sounds like everybody's kind of coalescing around kind of creating tools and venues to just inform people about like the state of things, like what actually is. So we can put together just kind of maybe an outline about kind of here's kind of what we heard based on the surveys and conversation, and here's what we propose as kind of the next few meetings, to just kind of work towards accomplishing that with, we don't get everything done by, our first commission report, but we can talk about some of the steps we'll be able to talk about some of the steps we've taken to synthesize and share what the commission has learned with the public in various formats.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think another key thing that we learned today is people wanting to know what happened on the front end with young people.
Does it make sense to try to like segment that way? Like, be thinking we want to make sure we're communicating out like this is what happens at the front end. Are there other like kind of key points throughout the process that we want to like make sure that we're clarifying?
When you say throughout the process, you mean like the process of a young person being in the system?
That's right.
I mean, I'm sure that they are. That entry point and front end is just kind of a reoccurring thing that we're hearing. I haven't heard any questions about what happens further along. But again, I'm sure that they are. I just haven't heard them as a part of this group.
I think how does detention work? Who's it for? I mean, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around detention in particular, and thinking that that should be a punishment for kids.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How does diversion work? When does diversion happen? I mean, there's a lot of points in the system where diversion is supposed to happen.
Okay.
I agree. That's good.
I mean, I think the fact that there are even paper charges, people assume that every kid who gets arrested gets brought to DJS, and they don't. Sometimes most kids, we just get a paper charge weeks or months later.
Okay. I'm writing some notes.
And for most kids, we don't get a request for detention, so we don't even do a DRED.
Okay. Well, we are right at 3 p.m. And it seems as though we do have a little, it's a little murky, but we do have a path forward, and we have some next steps focusing on the front end of services for young people, but also who gets detained, how are those decisions made, how do paper charges work, and what are the diversion options that are there. That's going to vary by jurisdiction as well, but we have some questions for sure that we can start with.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you the next session.
Thank you.
Hey, Eric.
Yes.